Rachel, and welcome to Hanukkah 2020, or Hanukkah 5781 as it were. I feel like I'm still experimenting with, I guess, lighting. Probably what I should be showing off most is the candles. Anyway, it is night one of Hanukkah, and as has been my custom these past few years, I am celebrating the holiday by reading from a collection of short stories and talking about one story per night. And this year I'm reading from the collection The Last Chicken in America by Ellen Littman. This is a collection of, I believe, interconnected short stories about a immigrant family, a Jewish family coming from Russia to live in Pittsburgh and Squirrel Hill, which sadly in the Jewish world is mostly in the news now, or mostly remembered now for the Tree of Life shooting. But this will be nice to get a little bit more perspective. So anyway, the first story in this collection is the titular story, Last Chicken in America. Perhaps not the most uplifting start to talking about the Jewish Squirrel Hill community, or at least the immigrant community, or at least this family of immigrants who are just having a lot of trouble acclimating. We have the protagonist, Masha, who's about college age, and her two parents who can't find a job because they can't master the language that well. And Masha's also having trouble like getting into college or things, so she's kind of struggling, and they're all kind of living together, spending a lot of time in the supermarket, sort of wowed by it, and the mother in particular seems to drag them along a lot, and you know, the title comes from her looking too long at chickens. But anyway, they're just, nobody's happy, everyone's pretty miserable and sort of griping at each other. And in the midst of all of that, Masha finds gets a boyfriend, Alec, who's also an immigrant and is also kind of struggling and is also kind of helping her and is also kind of demeaning to her and also kind of has a girlfriend on the side. Anyway, so we get into that. We talk a bit about her relationships with some of the women her age, or girls her age in their English class. Occasionally she talks vaguely about some memories from Moscow when, you know, things made sense. This is a long, straightforward, rambly kind of story. I mean, I don't know, I almost found it refreshing in a way because it's not experimental. It's kind of easy to understand. I mean, what it was just focusing on was sort of the depression of not fitting in and not knowing where you are, until the very end, where sort of a bad turn with Alec makes her parents, Masha's parents, kind of come back to parent her for the first time in a while, where they're actually a family again. I don't know, I enjoyed it, but I feel like there weren't a lot of frills or anything, or even, you know, exciting storytelling, which I guess now I'm judging it for the thing I said I liked about it. But it's interesting because I think a lot of short stories I've read lately are more experimental, or there's, you know, writing that's like a little more interesting or polished, but still, you know, this was a nice just a simple story about family and about loss and about trying to fit in, so like in the immigrant sense. And for another little Jewish aside in this ramble that I'm doing, it's interesting because they're like part of the secular Russian community, and Alec works at a kosher pizzeria serving a Haredi community, and you know, they don't like each other. So in a way, like, some of the culture clashes, you know, inter-religious. So, but that's what we got to deal with here. It's night two. I feel like I'm still experimenting badly with setting up so you can see the candles pretty well, but I'll try not to ramble so much tonight anyway. So getting right into it, tonight in this collection I read Charity, which is a continuation of Masha's story in the US. She is now studying computers at college, and she's the only member of her family who is at all employed. She is employed as a babysitter who's vastly underpaid, employed by a member of the Jewish community who basically is compelled to take charity on her as a Soviet Jew who's gotten out of the Soviet Union, as it were. And it is a commentary pretty much on the American Jewish community, and some hypocrisy is in here as well. For example, at one point in the story, Passover is about to happen, and they're in the car together, all of them, and the mother, Pamela, is explaining to her young son about how Passover is about the exodus of slaves of Jews from Egypt and slavery. And she says it's like today we as American Jews are helping Soviet Jews out of an exodus of slavery where they can't be Jewish, because that's a major difference between these two Jewish communities, is that Masha and her family have never been Jewishly educated or affiliated, because in part because they weren't allowed to in the Soviet Union, versus Pamela, who is a member of probably conservadox sort of synagogue for all her life anyway. So, but that's what she's saying, is that, we as the American Jews are helping the Soviet Jews be Jewish again. But meanwhile, she won't even invite this girl to her Passover Seder. So, we have our blind spots, I suppose. Well, at the very least, it seems like Pamela isn't completely one-dimensional stereotype, or at least she's a little different from everyone else in her congregation, because she's kind of frumpy and plumpy, and that plays into the fact that it seems that her husband is obviously not in the picture. We get a lot of emphasis on how he's always late, and he didn't even show up for, a Passover Seder or a Passover pageant. I don't know. And unsurprisingly, when Masha is out herself, she sees him cheating, and then goes to tell Pamela about it, and Pamela denies it. But in denying it, she also overpays Masha for the first time ever. Like, in fact, probably pays back a bunch of times that she didn't pay her before, when, she was distracted or something and didn't have the money, because finances, I don't know, aren't quite as tight for Pamela's family either, I guess. But anyway, that's the story. Just like a quick slice of life. I'm just struck again that it's pretty pedestrian, like just straightforward storytelling. I suppose I'm just paying a lot of attention lately to short story collections put out by small presses, and how experimental they are, and how steeped in language they are. And I feel like the two stories so far in here don't have any of that. I mean, they're straightforward and, kind of interesting in their way, and I'm personally invested whatever the Jewish community is involved in. It's not, either the Hasids, although they're somewhat in here, or, the Larry David Jews. Like, we get a little bit of variety. I mean, don't get a lot of emphasis on their practices, I guess, a little bit. We don't come off that great, I guess, if we're a little bit hypocritical in how we treat our own. But still kind of glad for the opportunity to read about them. Okay, it is night 3 of Hanukkah, and I think I found a good space placement for the menorah so you can see all the candles. I don't know why it was such a struggle this year. I mean, I have filmed this video other years. But anyway, I am here to talk about my next story in this collection. I'm going to talk about Russian Club, another Masha story where she's in college and struggling with her identity. She's ostensibly in college to pursue a computer science degree, and she's doing some sort of lab with some people, but she's barely participating, and she keeps on finding herself taking Russian literature courses. And then comes a semester where there's this new professor from Russia, Victor, who visits the club she's a part of, the Russian Club, and it's kind of obvious she kind of falls for him. It's not, explicitly stated like it's like a romantic thing, but it seems pretty obvious that she's kind of falling for him a little bit, and ends up taking his class, even though, she told herself no more Russian classes, and she has to worry about her degree and worry about time at the lab. But she's taking this class, and the professor is obviously, he's an immigrant, but he's somebody who thinks he'll go back to Russia, and is in love with sort of the Russian milieu of, the misery and depression of it, but it's still him. And meanwhile, everyone else in the Russian club actually didn't grow up in Russia the way that Masha did. So at the beginning, or for most of this story, Victor's really into her and is trying to get her to consider being a literature person and going back to Russia, and she's slowly spending less and less time in the lab until ultimately she gets fired from it anyway. But it's still, I think, really a story of identity and where you belong, because, she's supposed to be staying in America to stay, and the reason she took the computer science stuff is, it's a good job for immigrants, so she's really trying to make a name for herself here. And Victor really hates that idea, and he says, I don't want to deal with a dabbler or somebody who doesn't care as much about Russian literature and so forth as I do. So it kind of ends badly for the two of them ultimately, because she's not serious enough for him in his pursuits. So yeah, it's kind of like a story of identity and belonging in a strange academic sort of way. I'm not sure I was head over heels for the story. It was rambling. I didn't necessarily fall for the characters. Maybe it felt a little like filler, and that's one of those things, I guess, about novel in short story form. After a while, it can kind of feel like, I don't know how much I'm actually interested in Masha from this story versus, what has already been built up about her. But ultimately, I feel like I'm more interested in her from what I've read before. There are a few stories in here that aren't Masha stories, so maybe in the future I'll be talking about one of those, but we'll see. It is night 4 of Hanukkah, and I'm here to talk about the next story in this collection, The Peculiarities of National Driving, and it is indeed another Masha story, a short little one where sometime, we're going progressively through her life, so she's sometime out of college, I guess, or, at the end of college, I don't know. And her father is teaching her how to drive, and she's not very good at it, or he's sort of an anxious teacher. And they sort of name it The Peculiarities of National Driving, based off of a Soviet thing that they're also watching. But anyway, most of the story just takes place, and they're driving through Squirrel Hill and the surrounding area, and they end up at a mall, and Masha just thinks that her father might want another cigarette break or something, but instead they go into the mall, and he goes to a Kinko's to have something printed and faxed, or accessed and faxed from a floppy disk. You can tell what era this is from. And it turns out he has found a job for himself in Kansas, and had intended just to move there by himself, which pisses Masha off, because it's like he's grooming her to drive so that she can take care of her mother in his absence, because her mother is still a very anxious person and gets headaches and has always seemed a little out of it in all of these stories. So anyway, but once they get home, Masha unloads on a neighbor for a little bit, and then ultimately the father decides to stay in the Squirrel Hill area. And so the driving, I guess, is supposed to be some sort of metaphor for the uneasiness of what's going on, or the rocky roads, or, something like that. But again, this is very just slight, small, slice of life stuff, told in a relatively straightforward way without a lot of frills. So in the saga of following Masha's story, it's just a tiny little interlude. We'll see where she goes next. It is the 5th night of Hanukkah, and things are a little hectic here. You might have heard my phone going off. My friends group seems to be rather chatty right now. My cat is on the table, dangerously close to the menorah and the flames, and also the camera, which is on a makeshift tripod. But I'm not here to talk about any of that. I'm here to talk about the next book in this next short story in this collection, if I can get a word in edgewise. And indeed, it is a non-Masha story. It's a new protagonist, albeit still a young woman who was born and spent her formative years in Russia, and then spent high school in Squirrel Hill. But she is referred to, this story is told in second person, which gives it an interesting, immediate sort of feel. It's a longer story, and I think it covered a lot of interesting ground. She's about to go off to college, and she got into 2 colleges. She got into Boston, and she got into University of Pittsburgh, or Pitt. And her parents wanted her to go to Pitt because, it'll be a lot cheaper, not to do room and board. And all of her sort of life is in Squirrel Hill. Like, she could stay with her boyfriend, and her best friend and her could go to Pitt together. But she wants to go to Boston and study in Boston. And so she's dragging on sending the first check to Pitt and starting that journey. And, there's a lot of things that she might want to get away from at home. Her family's kind of strapped for money and there's medical problems. Her boyfriend, I don't know, he's not the greatest. He's getting into his boys and drugs, and, it's not quite so romantic anymore. And then she meets up with another non-Russian boy from school who's encouraging her to, follow the Boston dream. And so she's having this push and pull throughout the story about what to do with her life. And even though I said a lot of negatives about, her life at home, it's still very familiar to her. And she has these, plans to, go to Pitt with her friend after all, and all of that. And, it's not that easy to strike off on your own in a new place. So that's what she's going through, the push and pull in this story, and I thought it worked pretty well. Huzzah! Hello, hello. It's night 6 of Hanukkah. I've just read Among the Lilacs and the Girls, which returns us to Masha, kind of, although it's told from the perspective of her father this time, but we're still going sequentially through time, although Masha still seems to be in college, but she has her driver's license now and is thinking about working out of state. Anyway, this story is a lot about the sort of bewildering differences between American and Russian culture, because as has already been indicated through other stories, Masha's mother, Lena, has been sick. Sick is a way to put it. Basically, she's been depressed, except that like in Russia, or at least the Russia that these folks are from, depression is not a thing, or it's certainly not a thing, to be medicated and taken seriously in a medical profession. But especially when there's nothing else wrong with her physically, but they can't really think of anything else to do because she has this malaise, and so she ends up going to a bunch of hospitals and then gets on antidepressants, and it's just sort of the bewildering, what the heck is this sort of aspect to that. And in the background we have, oh yeah, they were professionals in Russia, and now they could barely find menial jobs in America. So it's that bewildering thing again, the culture clash thing again. So yeah, it's an interesting slice of life, I think. In other news, a snowstorm also, features in the story, another culture clash thing, because the father thinks that Americans are, too crazy about getting freaked out about snowstorms. But meanwhile, there's this rumor mill going around that my area in DC is about to get major snow tomorrow, perhaps enough to shut down work and all of that, if for those of us who, have to go into work during COVID. So I guess we'll see how that goes. It is night 7 of Hanukkah, and alas, there was no snow day between last night and tonight. I had to go into work like a normal person. There is no Masha story tonight to talk about, although there is a story about going into work in pre-COVID times. Not that, COVID's a part of this collection because it was published several years ago, but anyway, the story is called A Trajectory of Frying Pans, and it is told by a young man named Mike, or Misha, back in the day, but now, of course, he's out of Russia and living in Squirrel Hill like everyone else, and he's working in this company, he's on a series of just first dates that go nowhere, and mostly with people in the Russian community. But it's the same thing over and over, where they just don't seem to have something in common, or something seems to go wrong and they talk over each other. And then comes a new woman into work, Nadia, who's also from Russia, except she's married to an American man. And they strike up a bit of a friendship, and we get more into Mike's backstory, I guess, as it were, that when he and his family came to Russia, his girlfriend wanted to follow him, and he dissuaded her. And it becomes pretty apparent a big part of the reason why his relationships aren't working is because he doesn't trust the institution of relationships, and thinks even if you like each other, after a while you'll want to throw a frying pan at the other person. And this is sort of borne out by the fact that his own father, after arguing with his mother for years, just left the marriage bed, or the relationship, or what have you. And so he's talking some of this over with Nadia, and at first Nadia seems to have a happy marriage from the little snippets he gets, like that her husband drops her off, and they have conversations in the middle of the day and that sort of thing. But then as time goes on, Well, first of all, they move, and that puts strain on like the relationship, I guess, and the husband can't drive her anymore to work, and then she's pregnant, which apparently doesn't seem like the greatest thing, and you know, she seems more worn out, and so the two of them are flirting around the possibility of a relationship themselves, the two Russians in America, as it were. And so it's basically about that, about, you know, these sort of ideas, differing ideas of relationships. And what do you do when things get hard, or do you even put yourself out there at all to begin with? So even though, like a lot of these stories, there's some push and pull about what it means to be a Russian in America, or I think even there's reference to the fact that Misha might be Jewish when Nadia isn't, but I actually don't know if I'm well versed enough in sort of Russian culture to get that entirely. But overall, this seemed sort of a more general, universal sort of story that even people in America could kind of get, even if perhaps you know, we don't marry as often as the Russians do. At least that's a point that came up in this story, that we live together without marrying, which is more unusual apparently for the Russian community. So yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it. I thought it was relatively thought-provoking. Hello, it is the 8th and final night of Hanukkah, and I'm here to talk about the final story in this collection, The Last Chicken in America by Ellen Littman. And anyway, this story is called Home, where we return to Masha, but by this time she's moved away from home and is living in Boston, where she's given up her computer programming that she'd been doing for the past several stories, and has decided to teach Slavic languages, and she's in school and a struggling student, and seeing an American on the side, and their relationship's a little bit tepid, and he's also just a struggling student. And it's a question again of basically, where do you belong? She's returned home because one of her friends from the other stories is getting married in a sort of traditionally Russian fashion to a distant cousin and someone she knew ever since she came to America. And meanwhile, Masha is doing something quite different. I guess the good news is her parents at least have okay-ish jobs by this point, and her mom seems to be doing pretty well, so huzzah. But there's still that sort of push and pull, and they kind of, you know, aren't all that impressed with what she's doing. They wanted her to do the, you know, the IT computer stuff and, you know, have a more Russian stereotypical lifestyle, and they think like she's sort of abandoning her roots. And it seems like with a lot of these stories, it's a question of, well, who are you in this country, basically? And do you go off to do your own thing, or do you stay and do what's comfortable? And we don't really get to, I guess, much of a resolution by the end of it, except that she goes on the journey through the wedding anyway, where she's attending alone because her boyfriend is, of course, not with her. So that is that. I gotta say, overall, I guess I'm not hugely impressed by these stories. You know, I feel like for a few years now I've read more complicated stories, and I wanted something simpler, but I feel like there just wasn't a lot of art or artistry in these, but maybe I'm being too critical. But I do think, you know, they gave me a little something to talk about, perhaps a lot to talk about. I'm sure this video's rambled on long enough as it is. So I guess I will leave you with that. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this holiday experience, especially with coronavirus. You know, this digital tradition making stands out all the more. And I will be back in the near future with Friday Reads and other end-of-year videos, so huzzah! Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and hope all of my fellow Jews had a wonderful Hanukkah, and I will see you next time.